Well, if you've been watching the news, you know everyone's talking about guns. So we're going to join in this conversation. In your normal news cycle, you're probably going to hear people talk about the Australian gun buyback program. You're going to hear things like this.
During last week's White House listening session on school safety, one survivor of the Parkland, Florida massacre looked to Australia.
They took a lot of ideas, they put legislation together, and they stopped it. Can anyone here guess how many shootings there have been in the schools since then in Australia? 0.
Now that might sound pretty convincing. You might hear that and think, man, why don't we do something like that? We have all these mass shootings in the United States. Let's just end them. Let's just follow Australia's gun plan. Well, before we dive into why that's not a good idea and why that won't make a difference, let's give you some background on why Australia implemented their strict gun control laws. So in 1996, a man, 28 years old, murdered 35 people and wounded 23 others. This is a horrific event. And after it happened, the Australian government decided to implement much stricter control on the firearms in their country. This strict control also included a gun buyback program. Now, people might talk about this program like it was voluntary. Like if you wanted to save the children, you turn your guns in, but it was a mandatory gun buyback program. You had to give your firearms to the government. If you didn't, you were going to be charged with a crime. This gun buyback program took 1 million to about 1.5 million firearms out of the hands of Australian citizens. Now, people might say, to their credit, the homicide rate in Australia has dropped by 40% from 1996 to 2013. That's a significant amount. You might hear people say, why don't we do that? We have so many murders here in the United States. We need to do something. Well, you might also be surprised to find out that in the United States, our homicide rate has dropped by, surprise, 40% over the exact same amount of time. Another fact that you don't hear people talk about when it comes to the Australians and their guns is that Australia has just as many guns now as it did before 1996. People want their guns. People want their firearms. They're just having to purchase new weapons that fit into these restrictive classes that the Australian government has created. Now, interestingly enough, we can actually look at gun ownership in the United States and in Australia from 1996 to 2013. And as you can see in this graph here, those numbers seem to be kind of inverse to the amount of homicide. You can see that Australia, they have just as many guns now as they did in 1996, and yet their homicide rate dropped by 40%. The United States, we had almost exponential growth, it seems like, in the amount of firearms that were manufactured in the United States, and yet our homicide rate down by 40%. So what can we do? What can we do to make it so that shootings like the one in Florida don't happen, like the one in Las Vegas don't happen? Well, President Trump is all for banning bump stocks. Maybe we should take a look at those. Want to see how fast you can shoot an AR-15 without a bump stock? Well, so as you can see, banning bump stocks isn't going to stop people from shooting fast. You also might hear people say, well, you know, if we just get rid of all the guns, then people won't be able to commit suicide with them. And that will make a huge difference. And they're right. When you get rid of guns, people can't commit suicide with guns. But as you can see here, when you get rid of guns, people hang themselves. Suicide is suicide. It doesn't matter the weapon. They're going to use the most effective thing they can. And this study from Australia shows us that in every age group under 64 years old, when guns were taken away, they started using hangings. It's a relationship that's very strongly correlated in an inverse relationship. And so you can't just say, well, we'll get rid of the guns and people won't kill themselves. I mean, look at Japan. People kill themselves. It's unfortunate, and I think it's a terrible thing, and we should try and address that issue. So instead of spending this time talking about these things that aren't going to make a difference, let's talk about some solutions that might make a difference. One thing is that we have to look at the inner cities and the problems that we have there. A very statistically significant correlation exists between black populations and gun homicides. For every 1% increase in the black population, there's a 5.2% increase in gun homicides. I'm not saying that black people are just terrible people or there's anything wrong with black people, but I am saying that there's something wrong with our inner cities, and those populations tend to be very heavily populated with black people. And so we need to look at what we can do to help these people change the culture that exists in these inner cities that's leading kids to gangs and to violence. One other, I think, very effective form of gun control might be to institute some sort of law, like what Ben Shapiro over at the Daily Wire has been talking about. Ben's talked about instituting a law that would essentially allow close personal friends and loved ones to be able to take evidence to a court and say that this person they think is not suitable to be able to have a gun, and that if the evidence is convincing, the court would then be able to allow the police officers to suspend that person's right to own a gun for, say, 30 days, while the person who was asking for the right to be suspended has time to be able to gather enough evidence to be able to present it to the court to prove that this person is not someone who should be able to own a firearm. I think that's very reasonable legislation. I think that that doesn't infringe on anyone's rights in a way that doesn't allow for due process. And I think those kinds of gun control measures would help to keep people that are mentally unstable from having access to firearms. So I don't purport to have all the answers. I'm not telling you that I had the perfect solution that will solve all these problems. I think that it's a very complex problem that we need to look at from multiple angles. But let me know what you think, and let's have a good discussion.